What if everything you've ever been told about managing stress, like the deep breathing exercises, the mindfulness apps, the constant mantras to just, relax and let it go?
Mhm.
What if all of that is actually making your anxiety worse?
I mean, it's a pretty radical thought. We've basically spent the last 50 years building an entire culture and honestly a multi-billion-dollar wellness industry around this fundamental assumption that stress is just this toxic force that you have to eliminate at all costs.
Right. Like whether you're prepping for a high-stakes corporate presentation, or maybe you're a student pulling an all-nighter for finals, or you're just navigating the exhausting daily grind. The advice from society is incredibly consistent. Avoid stress.
Exactly. Avoid it, manage it, minimize it, do some yoga, take a mental health day. Just make the physical sensation of stress go away.
Yeah, well, today's deep dive is going to fundamentally dismantle that idea. What if the very act of trying to calm down is the exact thing that's destroying your body's ability to handle pressure?
We're going to explore why the physiological state of stress is actually not your enemy, and how teaching your brain to interpret that stress differently can literally alter the shape and function of your cardiovascular system.
And we're not just throwing around self-help theories today. We're grounding this entire conversation in a truly groundbreaking piece of scientific research. It's a paper titled, "A Synergistic Mindsets Intervention Protects Adolescents from Stress."
Yeah, and it was published in the highly prestigious journal Nature. The timeline is fascinating, too. It was accepted on May 25, 2022, and then published online on July 6, 2022.
The scientific pedigree behind this paper is just staggering. You have some of the most brilliant minds across psychology, behavioral science, statistics.
Right, we're looking at work by David S. Yeager, Christopher J. Bryan, James J. Gross, Jared S. Murray, Danielle Krettek Cobb, Pedro H. Santos, Hannah Gravelding, Meghann Johnson, and Jeremy P. Jamieson.
It's an absolute powerhouse collaboration. I mean, researchers from the University of Texas at Austin, Stanford University, the University of Rochester, and even Google's Empathy Lab, all combining their resources.
And the mission for our deep dive today is to really thoroughly unpack the six double-blind, randomized, controlled experiments that are outlined in this single paper.
Which is incredibly rare, right? To see 6 massive, rigorous experiments published together like that.
It's a huge testament to how deeply they wanted to prove this concept. They didn't just stop at a quick survey. They went into the real world, into schools, into medical laboratories, and even into the middle of a global pandemic.
We're going to guide you, the listener, through the exact setups of these studies. We'll look at the control groups, the experimental conditions, all the psychological measures, and the biological tests.
Because what these researchers proved is almost like science fiction. They proved that a brief, 30-minute self-administered online module can fundamentally alter human physiology, like actually changing how your blood vessels operate under pressure.
It's mind-blowing. But to really set the stakes for why this research is so urgent, we have to understand the specific type of stress they're targeting.
Exactly. Let's look at the actual source material.
Yeah, I want to bring in a direct quote right out of the gate. The authors write, "Social evaluative stressors experiences in which people feel they could be judged negatively pose a major threat to adolescent mental health."
Let's just pause on that term for a second. Social evaluative stressors. This isn't the stress of, like, running from a predator in the woods.
Right, it's not a bear chasing you.
No, it's the stress of standing in front of your peers and feeling like your worth, your intelligence, or your social standing is entirely on the line. It's that intense fear of negative judgment.
And the paper explains that when young people face this specific kind of social evaluative stress, and they've been taught their whole lives that stress is toxic, they do the most logical thing.
They completely disengage.
Exactly. They drop the hard math class, they quit the debate team, they avoid asking out that person they like, and the real tragedy is that this avoidance results in missed opportunities to acquire the exact skills they need to survive in adulthood.
Which brings us to the core flaw in how society views stress, right? I mean, if telling people to just avoid stress actually worked, we wouldn't be seeing record levels of anxiety and depression across the globe right now.
That is the ultimate paradox. We've never had more tools to manage stress, yet we have never been more stressed out. So why is conventional wisdom so flawed here?
Well, the paper explicitly calls out the danger in this societal narrative. The researchers point out that acquiring complex social and intellectual skills is just inherently unavoidably stressful.
You can't learn without a little friction.
Right, I'll quote the text directly here. Conventional thinking portrays stress as mostly a bad thing to be avoided or kept at bay. But this stress avoidance mentality ignores the reality that elevated levels of stress are a normal and, in many ways, even a desirable feature of adolescence.
Wait, a desirable feature? That is such a provocative phrase.
It is. But it makes sense when you really think about it. You cannot learn advanced calculus or navigate a complex romantic relationship or, lead a team at work without feeling a significant amount of stress. Growth requires friction.
That's so true.
And the researchers note that the modern labor market is highly technical and fiercely competitive. Tech has displaced a lot of routine, low-skill jobs. The economy basically demands advanced coursework in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics.
STEM classes.
Exactly. So if we broadcast a cultural message that high levels of stress are inherently damaging, we're essentially giving young people a permission slip to disengage from demanding pursuits. And that puts them at a severe, lifelong economic disadvantage.
So instead of this failed stress avoidance model, the paper proposes a radically different framework. They call it the stress optimization approach.
Yes, and to achieve this optimization, they introduce the core mechanism that they test across all 6 of these massive studies. They call it the Synergistic Mindsets Intervention.
Let's talk about this intervention, because it's wild how simple it is. It's a roughly 30-minute, self-administered online training module. That's literally it. 30 minutes on a computer.
Yeah, and for the control condition, because, in rigorous science, you always need a placebo, they used a neutral online activity of the exact same length.
And what did that placebo module actually teach them?
It taught basic facts about the brain. It even mentioned the sympathetic nervous system and the physiological stress response. But, and this is crucial, it completely omitted the specific mindset framing that the experimental module used.
Ah, I see. So they needed to ensure that simply thinking about the brain or spending 30 minutes reading about stress wasn't what was causing the changes.
Right, the placebo was meticulously designed to look and feel like a real intervention without delivering the active psychological ingredient.
Okay, let's look at that active ingredient, because this is where the theory gets really elegant. It doesn't just try to force you to think positively. It targets 2 very specific, intertwined mindsets, and it targets them synergistically.
The first piece of the puzzle is the growth mindset. A lot of people have probably heard of this one. It's the belief that intelligence and abilities aren't fixed traits that you're just born with.
Right. They're qualities that can be developed and strengthened
Yeah.
through effort and strategy.
Exactly. So in the context of stress, the growth mindset targets how you appraise the event itself. Like when a bad event happens, say you fail a math quiz, or your boss critiques your presentation.
A growth mindset helps you view that challenge as a helpful opportunity to learn, rather than like a permanent, devastating indictment of your core intelligence.
Precisely. That is the event appraisal. But a growth mindset alone isn't enough, which is where previous psychological interventions have sort of fallen short.
Because it's only half the equation.
Right. So this paper introduces the second critical piece, the stress can be enhancing mindset.
And this second mindset targets the response appraisal,
Right.
meaning how you interpret what your physical body is doing in that exact moment of stress.
Yes. The stress can be enhancing mindset is this profound belief that your physiological stress response, the racing heart, the sweaty palms, the rapid breathing, is actually your body mobilizing energy for optimal performance.
Oh, wow. So it teaches you that a pounding heart is not a sign that you're failing or having a panic attack.
Exactly. It's a sign that your body is giving you the exact biological resources you need to rise to the occasion.
Hold on. I want to make sure I'm visualizing this correctly. The brain essentially has to do 2 things almost simultaneously.
Right.
First, it looks at the outside world, like the difficult math test,
Yeah.
and has to say, this test is an opportunity to grow. That's the event appraisal.
Yep.
But then, almost instantly, the brain looks inward at the body's physical reaction, the pounding chest, and has to say, and this pounding heart is the fuel I need to crush this test.
Right.
That is the response appraisal.
That is exactly the sequence. And to really understand why both of those appraisals are absolutely necessary, we have to take a deep dive into the evolutionary biology of the human stress response.
Okay, let's do it.
Because the paper outlines 2 very different physiological pathways that our bodies can take when under pressure, the threat response and the challenge response.
Let's start with the threat response, because I think this is what most of us experience when we feel overwhelmed. What is actually happening under the hood there?
So when you encounter a stressor and your brain appraises it as harmful, uncontrollable, and exceeding your resources, like, say, a public speaking event where you're certain you'll be mocked.
Sure, nightmare fuel.
Exactly. Your body initiates a threat response. It prepares for damage or defeat. Evolutionarily, your brain thinks you are about to lose a physical fight.
The brain sends out an alarm.
Yes. It stimulates the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, which we commonly call the HPA axis.
Okay, and what does that cascade look like?
The hypothalamus in the brain signals the pituitary gland, which in turn signals the adrenal glands, which sit right on top of your kidneys, to flood your system with stress hormones, most notably cortisol.
Cortisol. We hear about that all the time in wellness blogs. But what is it actually doing physically in a threat response?
Well, beyond just releasing cortisol, a threat response triggers a massive physical change in your cardiovascular system. It drastically increases your vascular resistance.
Okay, what's the technical term for that?
In the literature, this is measured as total peripheral resistance, or TPR.
Total peripheral resistance. Let's translate that for the listener sitting at home. What does that mean in plain English?
It means your blood vessels constrict. They literally tighten up and narrow. The body does this to send less oxygenated blood to your limbs and periphery and keep more blood pooling in your core.
Oh, I see. Evolutionarily, if you are about to be mauled by a tiger, vasoconstriction is a brilliant survival mechanism. If your arm gets bitten, you bleed less because the blood vessels in your arm have clamped down.
Precisely. But in a modern context, when the tiger is just a math test, this physiological state of bracing for impact makes you feel cold, tight, and panicked. It leads directly to avoidance motivation and a highly negative mental state.
But the challenge response is a completely different biological pathway. Right, even though you were still technically stressed.
Entirely different. In a challenge response, you still experience high arousal. You are not calm. Let's be clear about that.
Right, you're not doing Zen breathing.
No. But your brain has appraised the event as a challenge that you do have the resources to handle. Instead of preparing for physical damage and defeat, your body mobilizes resources for peak physical and mental performance.
So what happens to the blood vessels in a challenge response?
They do the exact opposite. Instead of constricting, your peripheral blood vessels dilate. They open up. You see a significant increase in peripheral blood flow. And furthermore, you see an increase in stroke volume.
Stroke volume meaning the actual amount of blood the heart pushes out with every single beat.
Exactly. Your heart is not just beating faster, it's pumping a larger volume of blood with incredible efficiency. Your body is essentially opening up the physiological highways to deliver massive amounts of oxygenated blood and glucose to your brain and your muscular tissues.
So you are biologically primed to think faster, speak clearer, and perform at your absolute peak.
You've got it.
Okay, this is fascinating. As you explain this, it makes me think of like a smartphone operating system. Let me try an analogy here.
Go for it.
It sounds like past psychological interventions only updated one app at a time on the phone. For example, a student goes to the school counselor, and the counselor updates their growth mindset app.
Okay, yeah.
So cognitively, the student believes, I can learn math, this test is an opportunity. But then they sit down for the exam, the adrenaline hits, their heart starts pounding, and because their stress response app is still running outdated software that says a racing heart equals a panic attack, the whole system experiences a fatal error.
That's a great way to put it.
Right. The brain says, I can do this, but the body is screaming, we are under attack. The cognitive dissonance just crashes the whole phone.
I like that analogy, but let's refine it just a bit.
Right.
It is not merely that the old app drains the battery, it's that the hardware is actively rejecting the software.
Wait, how do you mean?
Well, if you have a growth mindset, cognitively, but your cardiovascular system is locked in a threat response with high total peripheral resistance and those constricted blood vessels we talked about, your brain literally isn't getting the oxygenated blood it needs to execute the complex cognitive tasks required for that growth mindset.
Oh, wow. The biological hardware is overriding the psychological software.
Yes. So that is why targeting just one mindset is doomed to fail. You need the synergy of both. The Synergistic Mindsets intervention essentially provides a complete OS update, ensuring that both the psychological software and the cardiovascular hardware are speaking the exact same language.
That is brilliant.
And that's the exact mechanism the researchers hypothesized. In the past, effective scientists have tried what they call reappraisal therapies, teaching people to reinterpret a specific stressful event like a single upcoming exam. But those interventions suffered from what psychologists call the transfer problem.
The transfer problem, meaning the lesson doesn't stick when the context changes.
Precisely. People might successfully reappraise one specific stressor while they're sitting in a therapist's office or a university lab, but when they walk out the door and encounter a novel, unexpected stressor in their daily lives, they fail to transfer that skill. The anxiety just comes rushing back.
That makes a lot of sense.
So by targeting these deep foundational mindsets synergistically, by changing the core belief about the nature of stress itself, the researchers hope to solve the transfer problem once and for all. They wanted to empower adolescents to see both the external stressful event and their internal physiological response as resources to be harnessed, regardless of what the specific stressor was.
So to prove that this OS update actually works and actually transfers to the messy reality of the real world, the researchers launched into the first 2 of their 6 studies. Let's look closely at how they tested these cognitive appraisals, starting with experiment 1.
Okay, so the context and the scale here are massive. We are looking at a sample size of 2,717 public school students in the United States.
Over 2,000 kids.
Yeah, teenagers, ages 13 to 18. And crucially, this data was collected during the COVID-19 pandemic.
That context cannot be overstated. Baseline stress levels for teenagers during the pandemic were historically high. The ambient anxiety in the environment was palpable.
Exactly. To test the intervention in this environment, they randomized the students. Half received the Synergistic Mindsets module, and half received the Neutral Control module teaching brain facts.
So that is the setup. What did they ask the students to do after taking the module?
They used a highly controlled hypothetical scenario. They asked these thousands of students to imagine a very specific, deeply uncomfortable situation. The prompt asked them to imagine that the teacher of their absolute most difficult course had just assigned a highly demanding, strictly timed project.
Okay, stressful but normal high school stuff.
But then, to make it worse, they would have to present their final work out loud in front of all their classmates.
Oh man, for a 14-year-old, that is a literal nightmare scenario. Public speaking, peer judgment, a strict deadline, and it's in the subject you struggle with the most. It's a pure, distilled, social evaluative stressor.
It is entirely designed to immediately trigger that fear of negative judgment. Once the students were visualizing this scenario, the researchers measured 2 distinct things: their event-focused cognitive appraisals and their response-focused cognitive appraisals.
Meaning they asked the students to self-report how they viewed the assignment itself, and then how they viewed the physical stress they were imagining feeling.
Right. They asked questions to gauge how much of a negative threat the students considered the presentation to be, and whether they believed their body's inevitable stress response, like the sweating, the shaking, would ultimately hurt or help their final performance.
And what were the results? I mean, did the 30-minute module actually change how they visualized this nightmare scenario?
The effect sizes were statistically highly significant. The intervention successfully reduced negative event-focused appraisals. The average treatment effect, or ATE, was a reduction of 1.11 standard deviations.
Wow.
And it reduced negative response-focused appraisals by an ADE of 0.19 standard deviations.
Okay, I have to stop you there because we promised the listener we wouldn't just throw standard deviations at them without real context. In the real world, outside of a statistics textbook, what does a shift of nearly a fifth of a standard deviation actually look like?
It's a really great question. In population-level behavioral science, when you were dealing with a sample size of nearly 3,000 diverse students, a shift of that magnitude from a single brief intervention is massive.
Really?
Yeah. Imagine a massive high school auditorium filled with hundreds of students who are absolutely paralyzed by the thought of public speaking.
Yeah.
A shift of 0.19 standard deviations is the equivalent of walking into that room and entirely neutralizing that paralyzing panic for dozens and dozens of those students all at once, shifting them from a state of pure dread to a state of manageable anticipation.
That is incredible. But as powerful as that is, Experiment 1 was still just a hypothetical scenario. It's easy to imagine being brave.
True.
So Experiment 2 is where the researchers really turned up the heat and tested the transfer problem in real time. Let's set the stage for Experiment 2. The context shifts to 755 undergraduate students. They are enrolled in a highly competitive introductory social science course at a selective public university.
The setup is the same. One group gets the synergistic intervention, the other gets the placebo control. But what they're measuring here is entirely different. They are not asking about a hypothetical presentation.
They're using a real one.
Exactly. They're measuring the students' cognitive appraisals of a real acute stressor, a challenging, strictly timed social science quiz that actually impacts their grade.
And the timing of these measurements is what makes this study so vital, right?
Yes. They measured the students' stress appraisals immediately after the first real quiz, which took place roughly 1 to 3 days after they completed the 30-minute online module.
Okay, so it's fresh in their minds.
Right. But then they waited. They let 3 weeks of normal, chaotic college life pass by. And then, after a second, equally challenging timed quiz, they measured their appraisals again.
So they are testing to see if the psychological software update from the module actually stays installed in the brain after weeks of wear and tear. What did the data show?
Immediately after that first real quiz, the experimental group, the ones who took the Synergistic model, showed significantly less negative stress appraisals compared to the control group. The average treatment effect was a massive drop of 0.39 standard deviations.
That is huge. That means a huge portion of the class walked out of that hard quiz feeling mobilized rather than defeated. But what about 3 weeks later? Did the effect just sort of vanish?
It did not. 3 weeks later, without any booster sessions, without any reminders, the protective effect persisted. The students in the experimental group still showed a significant reduction in negative stress appraisals, with an effect size of 0.18 standard deviations, better than the control.
Let's really pause and think about what that means for the transfer problem we discussed earlier. The online module they took 3 weeks prior never explicitly mentioned a social science quiz. It just taught them the fundamental nature of stress and the brain.
Exactly.
And yet, weeks later, when faced with a naturalistic stressor in their actual lives, their brains automatically applied that synergistic framework. The OS update worked in the background.
It proves that the mindset intervention is durable. It reshapes the lens through which they view adversity, and that new lens stays in place even as the specific details of the adversity change.
Okay, I'm going to step in here and push back pretty hard on behalf of you, the listener, because if I'm listening to this, my skeptical alarm bells are ringing.
Fair enough. Let's hear it.
Self-reporting on a survey is incredibly subjective. If I just took a 30-minute module where a researcher told me stress is actually good for you, and then a week later that same researcher hands me a survey asking, do you think stress is good for you? I am probably going to check the box that says yes.
Right. It is classic demand characteristics. People want to give the right answer.
Exactly. I can tell you on a piece of paper that my stress is totally enhancing my performance, but my sweaty palms, my shaky voice, and my racing heart might tell a completely different story. How do we know this isn't just a massive placebo effect? Did the researchers actually look under the hood at the hard biological data to prove these surveys weren't just wishful thinking?
That is the exact critical limitation that the researchers themselves anticipated. They knew that self-reports, no matter how statistically significant, are inherently subject to self-presentation biases.
Right.
People might just be reporting what they think the scientists want to hear. So to truly definitively prove their hypothesis, they couldn't just look at what the mind was saying. They had to look at what the autonomic nervous system was doing.
Which brings us to the laboratory, the physiological proof. Let's dive deep into experiments 3 and 4, because this is where the science gets truly mind-bending. Let's set the stage for experiment 3.
Okay, so we have 160 undergraduate students, and the task the researchers subjected them to is infamous in the world of psychology. It's called the Trier Social Stress Test, or the TSST.
If you are a scientist and you need to reliably, consistently induce an intense threat-type stress response in a laboratory setting, the TSST is the undisputed gold standard, isn't it?
It really is. It is designed to be deeply, fundamentally unpleasant.
Paint a picture for us. What does it actually feel like to be a participant in the TSST?
Imagine you walk into a stark, brightly lit laboratory room. You are immediately informed that you have exactly 3 minutes to prepare an impromptu 5-minute speech detailing your personal strengths and your personal weaknesses, as if you are interviewing for your dream job.
3 minutes to prepare a 5-minute speech is brutal. The math doesn't even work. You are guaranteed to run out of prepared material and have to improvise.
And it gets worse. You are told you have to deliver the speech to a panel of peer evaluators. You walk into the next room and the evaluators are sitting behind a desk holding clipboards just staring at you. But these are not friendly evaluators. They are actors, explicitly trained by the researchers to provide only negative, discouraging, nonverbal feedback.
So no smiling, no nodding along encouragingly.
None. As you stumble through your speech about your weaknesses, the evaluators are instructed to furrow their brows. They sigh audibly, they cross their arms defensively, they look bored, disappointed, and highly critical. They offer absolutely zero positive reinforcement.
Just feeling the social rejection radiating off them, that is awful. And if that intense social evaluative stress isn't enough, What happens next?
Well, as soon as the 5-minute speech is over, without any prior warning whatsoever, the judges stare at you and demand that you immediately begin a surprise mental math test.
Oh, no.
You are instructed to count backwards from the number 996 in increments of 7 as fast as possible out loud.
996, 989, 982.
Yep.
Doing that out loud while people glare at you is terrifying.
And if you make a single mathematical error, if you stutter or say the wrong number, the judges immediately interrupt you in a harsh tone and force you to start over from the very beginning at 996.
It is an orchestrated nightmare.
Right.
It is designed to make you feel like you are failing socially and intellectually at the exact same time.
Yeah.
And during this entire ordeal, what are the researchers measuring? Because they aren't just giving them a survey afterward, are they?
Not at all. Before the test even begins, the participants are wired up to a suite of advanced medical monitors. The researchers are utilizing electrocardiography, or ECG, which measures the electrical activity of the heart.
Okay, pretty standard.
But they are also using impedance cardiography, or ICG, which measures the mechanical functioning of the heart, how blood is physically flowing through the chest. And they are using continuous beat-to-beat blood pressure monitors.
Okay, let's space these metrics out so we really understand what the researchers are hunting for in all this raw biological data. What is the first key indicator they extract?
The most critical metric they are looking for is total peripheral resistance, or TPR. We mentioned this earlier. TPR is the primary undisputed indicator of a threat response.
Right. It is the mathematical measurement of vasoconstriction, how tightly the blood vessels in the body's periphery are clamping down.
Exactly. The feeling of your hands getting cold and your chest getting tight because the body is preparing for physical damage.
What else are they looking at?
They are also measuring stroke volume, the precise amount of blood ejected from the left ventricle of the heart on every single beat. And finally, they measure the pre-ejection period, or PP.
What does that measure?
This is a highly sensitive metric of sympathetic nervous system arousal. It measures the tiny fraction of a second between the electrical signal firing in the heart and the physical opening of the aortic valve. It tells the researchers exactly how hard the biological engine is revving.
Okay, so the setup here is that half the students took the 30-minute Synergistic mindset module before coming into the lab, and half took the neutral placebo. Both groups are subjected to the nightmare of the scowling judges and the mental math. What did the biological data reveal? Did the module actually stop their blood vessels from constricting?
The results were profound. The experimental condition, the students equipped with the synergistic mindset, drastically reduced their total peripheral resistance during the intense speech portion of the test.
How drastically?
The average treatment effect was a staggering reduction of 223 DINAs times centimeters to the -5th.
Okay, wait. DINAs times centimeter to the -5th is a mouthful of a medical unit. What does that number actually mean for the human being standing in that room?
To put it in visceral perspective, the students in the control group who had the placebo module experienced severe vasoconstriction. Their physiological pipes tightened up. Their bodies were locked in a threat state, preparing for defeat, hoarding blood in the core.
Got it. And the others?
The students who took the 30-minute mindset module, their cardiovascular system looked entirely different on the monitors. Their blood vessels remained dilated. They exhibited a classic challenge response. Their hearts pumped larger volumes of blood to their periphery.
Hold on. I want to make sure I am fully grasping the magnitude of this. You were telling me that a 30-minute web module that a college kid clicked through on their laptop was powerful enough to override an ancient, hardwired evolutionary survival mechanism during a live, highly hostile social attack.
That is exactly what the data proves. The mindset framing literally widened their blood vessels under pressure.
That is mind-blowing. But the researchers, being as rigorous as they are, didn't just stop at experiment 3. They ran experiment 4 to replicate this finding, but they added a crucial twist to test the specific theory of synergy. Let's look at experiment 4.
Right, so experiment 4 involves 200 undergraduate students. They replicate the exact same Trier social stress test, though this time they focus just on the speech portion to isolate the social evaluative stress. But the experimental design here is brilliant. It is a 4-cell experiment.
A 4-cell experiment, meaning they divided the students into 4 distinct groups instead of just 2. Why?
Because they needed to definitively prove that you must have the synergy of both mindsets to get these physiological benefits. They needed to prove that updating just one app, to use your analogy, isn't enough.
So what were the 4 groups?
Group 1 received the neutral control placebo. Group 2 received a module that taught only the growth mindset. Group 3 received a module that taught only the stress can be enhancing mindset, and Group 4 received the full integrated synergistic mindsets module.
Ah, this is the ultimate test of the cognitive dissonance theory. If you only give a student half the tools, does the body still crash into a threat response?
Exactly. They analyzed the biological data using an incredibly advanced statistical filter designed to strip away any random noise or baseline differences between the students. And the findings were crystal clear.
Did it replicate?
First, they perfectly replicated the main finding. The synergistic mindset group showed massively reduced vasoconstriction compared to the control group. The effect size was a reduction of 0.44 standard deviations.
But what about the single mindset groups? Did the growth-only or stress-only modules work even a little bit?
No. Neither the growth-only intervention nor the stress-only intervention reliably reduced total peripheral resistance relative to the placebo control. They flat out did not work on their own.
Well, that's definitive.
The synergistic approach was 0.34 standard deviations better than the stress-only module and 0.42 standard deviations better than the growth-only module. I will quote the paper directly on this point. Heterogeneity analyses and a 4-cell experiment, study 4, showed that the benefits of the intervention depended on addressing both mindset's growth and stress synergistically.
Okay, I have to ask the ultimate why question here. If I am in that lab room and the judges are glaring at me, rolling their eyes at my speech, how exactly does the psychological synergy bridge the gap to my cardiovascular system? What is the actual physical mechanism that translates a thought into widened blood vessels?
It all comes down to how the autonomic nervous system takes direct orders from our cognitive appraisals. Let's trace the pathway.
Please do.
When you are standing in front of those scowling judges, your sensory organs send that data to your brain. If your brain interprets that data and concludes, this is a threat I cannot handle, it sends an emergency signal down to the hypothalamus.
And the hypothalamus is the control center for the physical stress response.
Exactly. The hypothalamus instantly triggers the sympathetic nervous system, ordering it to prioritize basic physical survival. The resulting command is, clamp down the peripheral blood vessels, pool the blood in the core organs, and prepare for trauma.
Right. That's the default we talked about. But, and this is where the magic happens, if your brain has been trained by the synergistic module, the sequence changes.
How so?
Well, your sensory organs still see the scowling judges. You still feel the intense physiological arousal, the pounding heart. But your brain appraises the scowls as a challenge to overcome. That's the growth piece.
Yes.
And then it appraises the pounding heart as the necessary fuel to overcome it. That's the stress is enhancing piece.
Yeah.
Because the appraisal has changed, the signal sent to the hypothalamus changes.
You've got it perfectly. The hypothalamus still activates the sympathetic nervous system. You are still highly aroused. But it directs the system to facilitate performance, not survival.
The body literally believes the story the mind is telling it.
Exactly. The hypothalamus signals the cardiovascular system to dilate the peripheral blood vessels, increase the stroke volume of the heart, and actively deliver massive amounts of oxygenated blood and glucose to the prefrontal cortex so you can think clearly, speak eloquently, and navigate the social challenge.
The mind leads, and the entire cardiovascular system follows.
Exactly.
That is profound. The stories we tell ourselves about our own anxiety literally dictate the shape of our internal physiology. But as incredibly rigorous as this laboratory testing is, we have to acknowledge a fundamental truth. A lab is still an artificial environment.
True.
The participants are wired up to ECG machines. They know they are in an experiment. It only lasts an hour, which requires us to look at experiment 5. What happens to the human body day after day, week after week, out in the messy reality of the wild.
This brings us to experiment 5, which investigates chronic stress in the wild. And honestly, this is arguably the most intensive, logistically complex study in the entire paper. The context here shifts dramatically from college undergrads in a lab.
Tell us about the demographic they studied here, because it is critical to understanding the stakes of this research.
The participants in experiment 5 were 118 adolescents, ages 14 to 16. They were predominantly from racial or ethnic minority groups, and they were facing significant economic disadvantages. They attended a rigorous, demanding public high school in the United States.
So we are talking about a highly vulnerable demographic that is disproportionately burdened by chronic, systemic, and environmental stress on top of the normal academic pressures of high school.
Exactly. The researchers wanted to see if this 30-minute intervention could act as a biological shield, protecting vulnerable teenagers from the toxic, compounding effects of chronic daily stress.
How did they test that out in the real world?
The experimental setup was incredibly rigorous. The students took either the synergistic intervention or the control module at the beginning of the study. Then the researchers let them go back to their normal lives. About 14 days later, the rigorous testing began. The participants were required to complete 5 consecutive days of intensive daily diaries.
And what exactly were the researchers measuring with these diaries and tests? What were the variables?
They measured 3 distinct variables over time. First, they tracked daily negative self-regard, meaning how badly the students felt about themselves on a day-to-day basis.
Okay, that's one.
Second, they measured the chronic activation of the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis by analyzing daily cortisol levels. And third, which is the ultimate real-world metric, they tracked the students' actual course pass rates on their high school transcripts 7 months later.
Let's break down how they captured this data, because getting high schoolers to reliably report on their biology sounds nearly impossible. How did the diaries work?
The diaries had to be completed twice a day, every single day for 5 days, once at lunch and once in the afternoon. The surveys asked the students to report the intensity of the daily stressors they faced, arguments with friends, academic failures, trouble at home, and to report their level of negative self-regard.
And what about the biology part?
But the biological testing is where the true rigor lies. They didn't just ask how stressed they felt, they collected physical saliva samples from these teenagers 3 times a day, morning, lunch, and afternoon.
Collecting saliva 3 times a day in a high school cafeteria. The logistics of that alone are staggering. And what did they do with those hundreds and hundreds of saliva swabs?
They transported them to a lab to measure the daily free cortisol levels, but they didn't use standard basic testing. They analyzed the saliva using liquid chromatography, tandem mass spectrometry, or LC-MSMS.
Okay, I have to ask why that specific, highly complex sounding test? Why not just use a standard, cheap chemical swab?
Because LC-MSMS is the absolute gold standard in modern endocrinology. It is incredibly precise. First, it uses liquid chromatography to physically separate the various compounds in the saliva sample. Then it uses 2 sequential mass spectrometers to measure the precise mass-to-charge ratio of the molecules.
Why is that level of precision necessary?
Because cheaper tests often suffer from cross-reactivity. They might accidentally count other hormones as cortisol, which completely skews the data. By using LC-MSMS over multiple days, at multiple specific times of day, the researchers could map the exact, highly accurate curve of the student's chronic background HPA axis activation.
Oh, so they could see exactly how much biological stress these teenagers were carrying around in their bodies every single day.
Precisely.
Okay, the setup is bulletproof. So what did this gold standard testing reveal? Did the 30-minute module actually protect these teenagers in the wild?
The results were extraordinary across all 3 variables. First, let's look at the psychological data. Daily negative self-regard dropped significantly in the treatment group. The overall effect size was a reduction of 0.19 standard deviations. But what is truly remarkable is what happened on the high-stress days.
You mean the days where the kids reported facing intense social evaluative stressors like failing a test or being mocked?
Exactly. On those specific terrible days, the protective effect of the mindset module nearly doubled. The reduction in negative self-regard on high-stress days was 0.32 standard deviations.
So the intervention acted like a psychological shock absorber. It worked best exactly when they needed it the most, preventing a bad day from spiraling into a total collapse of self-worth.
That's a perfect description.
But what about the biology? Did the daily cortisol levels actually change?
They did. The biological data perfectly mirrored the psychological data. The overall HPA axis activation, the daily salivary cortisol levels tracked by the mass spectrometry, were significantly lower in the experimental group.
By how much?
The effect size was a reduction of 0.23 standard deviations compared to the control group. The synergistic module literally lowered the volume of chronic stress hormones pumping through their veins.
I want to pause and make an analogy here because I think it is vital to visualize what chronic cortisol actually does to a young developing body over time. Think of the human body like a car engine.
Okay, I'm with you.
The cortisol drip we are talking about is like running that car engine constantly in the red zone, near the maximum RPMs. If your body is constantly flooding with cortisol, because you were trapped in chronic threat responses, it's like driving on the highway stuck in second gear.
You are moving forward, but the engine is screaming.
Exactly. Sure, you might be surviving, but over time, that heat and friction ruins the transmission. It causes severe, irreversible wear and tear on the machinery. What this intervention did was essentially give these kids a psychological transmission upgrade.
Right.
It allowed their brains to shift into fifth gear, letting them cruise through the exact same intense academic and social stressors without burning out their biological engines.
That is a deeply accurate way to conceptualize the physical toll of chronic HPA axis activation. The medical term for that engine damage is allostatic load.
Allostatic load.
And if we connect this biological finding to the broader psychological picture, the paper stresses a very important clinical point. Negative self-regard and chronic HPA axis activation are primary precursors to clinical anxiety and major depressive disorders in adolescents.
Oh, wow.
So by lowering daily cortisol and interrupting the cycle of negative self-regard, this intervention is essentially providing a systemic buffer against future severe psychopathology.
It is preventative medicine for the mind. And the ultimate proof of that buffer, the ultimate real-world consequence of a healthy engine, is found in the third variable the researchers tracked, academic success.
This is where the long-term impact becomes undeniable. 7 months after the students took that single 30-minute online module, the researchers went back and looked at their official high school transcripts. They focused specifically on core STEM classes: science, technology, engineering, and math.
The really tough ones.
Yeah, exactly. These are the notoriously difficult, highly stressful classes that teenagers often avoid or fail out of when they feel overwhelmed.
What did the transcripts show?
In the control group, who received the placebo module, only 47% of the students successfully passed their core STEM classes. More than half of them failed.
And the treated group?
But in the treated group, the students armed with the synergistic mindset, 63% passed. That is an absolute difference of 14.5 percentage points.
That is absolutely staggering. We need to really let that sink in. A 14.5 percentage point bump in passing the hardest classes in school. Think about the massive trajectory shift that represents for a young person's life, especially a young person facing economic disadvantage.
It's massive.
Passing or failing core STEM classes in early high school often dictates whether you graduate on time, whether you are eligible for college, what kind of scholarships you can get, and ultimately your earning potential for the rest of your adult life.
And it was achieved not by tutoring them in math, but by giving them a 30-minute tool to engage with the stress of the rigorous coursework, rather than withdrawing from it. They learned to view the friction of learning as a resource.
It is a monumental finding, but
Yeah.
as amazing as passing STEM classes is, it raises one final critical question. Academic stress, no matter how intense, is somewhat predictable. You generally know when the math test is coming. You know when the essay is due.
Right.
What happens when the stressor is completely unpredictable? What happens when the adversity is entirely outside the realm of a school building? That question leads us to the final study in the paper, the ultimate unplanned test, Experiment 6.
Experiment 6 is one of those incredibly rare moments in the history of science where a massive global historical event directly intercepts an ongoing psychological experiment.
Let's lay out the timeline and the context because it is wild. We have a sample size of 341 undergraduate college students. The intervention, the random assignment into either the synergistic module or the placebo control, was delivered in late January of 2020.
Think about the mindset of the world in late January 2020. COVID-19 was barely a blip on the radar for the vast majority of American college students. They were worried about midterms and dating.
Right. But by March 2020, just 6 or 7 weeks later, the entire world shut down. The students in this study were suddenly evicted from their dorms. They were sent into immediate quarantine.
Exactly.
They were dealing with the chaotic rollout of remote learning, profound social isolation, and massive, terrifying global uncertainty. It was a period of unprecedented societal stress.
The researchers suddenly realized they had a once-in-a-lifetime natural experiment on their hands. The foundational setup was already locked in. The students were already randomized. The independent variable was already applied months prior.
So what did they do?
The researchers rapidly pivoted their tracking metrics. Instead of measuring academic stress, they shifted their dependent variable to measure generalized internalizing symptoms during a crisis.
When did they measure this?
In mid-April 2020, right in the absolute thick of the first, most terrifying, most lockdown wave of the pandemic, they evaluated all 341 students using the Generalized Anxiety Disorder 7 scale, commonly known as the GAD-7.
The GD7 isn't just a basic survey, right? It is a serious clinical diagnostic tool.
Precisely. It is a standardized questionnaire used by physicians and psychiatrists globally to screen for clinical anxiety disorders.
What kind of questions does it ask?
It asks patients to rate how often over the past 2 weeks they have been bothered by symptoms like feeling nervous, anxious, or on edge, or not being able to stop or control worrying, or feeling afraid as if something awful might happen. It measures the deep, pervasive dread of generalized anxiety.
So, measuring college students with this tool in April 2020, you would expect the scores to be off the charts for everyone. What did the data actually show between the two groups?
The effect size was remarkable. The experimental group, who had taken the 30-minute Synergistic module way back in January, showed a statistically significant reduction in generalized anxiety symptoms on the GAD-7 compared to the control group during the lockdown.
I want to make sure I'm hearing this correctly. They took a short online module designed to help them cope with college midterms, and it ended up actively protecting their mental health against the psychological fallout of a once-in-a-century global pandemic.
Yes, and that finding is the ultimate proof of what the researchers call the situation general nature of the synergistic mindset. I will quote the author's conclusion directly here. Our research has identified a treatment for adolescent stress that could, in principle, be scaled nationally at low cost.
That's incredible.
The reason it scales and the reason it protected them during a pandemic is because the synergistic mindset doesn't teach you a specific trick for a specific math test. It teaches you a fundamental underlying philosophy about the nature of adversity itself and your body's physiological capacity to rise to that adversity.
Okay, I have to jump in here with a very important clarification. Because if someone is listening to this deep dive right now, they might be thinking, wait a minute, are you telling me that a 30-minute mindset module cures severe trauma? Are you saying we should just mindset our way out of tragedy?
No, absolutely not.
Because the paper explicitly states in its own text that this intervention is not meant to treat serious trauma, abuse, or systemic oppression. So how do we responsibly reconcile that important disclaimer with the fact that it apparently helped these students during a global pandemic lockdown, which was undeniably a deeply traumatic event for millions of people?
It is an incredibly important nuance, and we have to draw a clear line here. The authors are extremely careful in the text. They state unequivocally, the intervention is not designed to change people's appraisals of serious, negative, and uncontrollable stressors, such as trauma or abuse. You cannot and should not try to synergize your way out of objective abuse or deep trauma.
So how did it help during the lockdown?
Because the synergistic mindset works by helping people cope with the normal, controllable stressors of preparing for adulthood, even while they are surrounded by uncontrollable external crises.
Oh, I see.
Think about the college student in April 2020. The pandemic is an uncontrollable, massive external stressor. The student cannot fix the pandemic. But the student still has to write a 10-page essay for their history class via Zoom. The student still has to figure out how to maintain a long-distance relationship.
The intervention doesn't make the pandemic a good thing.
Exactly. It doesn't reframe the trauma of the pandemic as a positive challenge. What it does is stop the student's autonomic nervous system from collapsing into a paralyzing threat response while they are trying to engage with the things they can control, like doing their homework or talking to their family. It helps them stay engaged with their personal internal goals despite the chaotic, uncontrollable external environment.
That makes total sense, and it is a vital distinction. It optimizes your biological and psychological response to the friction of daily life, preventing the compounding tragedy where an external crisis causes you to completely abandon your internal potential.
Exactly. It builds an internal locus of resilience.
Which brings us to the end of this absolutely massive scientific journey. Let's take a moment to summarize the sheer scope of what we have unpacked today. We started with the radical idea that stress avoidance is failing us. We introduced a 30-minute, self-administered online module that teaches a synergistic combination of a growth mindset and a stress-can-be-enhancing mindset.
We saw how that single module shifted the cognitive appraisals of hypothetical and real-world academic tests across thousands of teenagers, proving that the mindset transfers to novel situations.
We followed the researchers into the highly controlled environment of a laboratory, where we watched this mindset literally widen the blood vessels of college students, transforming a panicked, vasoconstricted threat response into a highly oxygenated, biologically optimized challenge response under the brutal pressure of the Trier social stress test.
We then went out into the wild, tracking the daily saliva of disadvantaged high schoolers, proving that the intervention lowered chronic daily cortisol levels, reduced negative self-regard, and ultimately raised their passing rates in incredibly difficult STEM classes by 14.5 percentage points.
And finally, we saw this underlying psychological framework weather the storm of a global pandemic buffering young adults against clinical generalized anxiety during a period of profound global isolation. The consistency of the data across these 6 separate studies is what makes this paper a true landmark.
It really does. They proved it with subjective surveys, they proved it with hard cardiovascular metrics, they proved it with long-term academic transcripts, and they proved it with clinical psychological scales.
It is a masterclass in thorough, irrefutable behavioral science. So, as we wrap up this deep dive, what is the core takeaway for you listening to this right now? It is true that this specific paper focused heavily on adolescence, because adolescence is the critical developmental window when these foundational mindsets solidify.
But the biological hardware in our bodies, the exact physiological machinery we have been discussing, is exactly the same regardless of your age.
Right. The HPA axis, the sympathetic nervous system, the mechanisms of vasoconstriction and strike volume, they operate on the exact same evolutionary rules, whether you are 15 years old taking a biology test or 50 years old stepping into a boardroom to defend your company's quarterly earnings.
The mechanism of human physiology does not change. The biology of stress is a human constant.
So the next time you are facing a high-stakes moment, a demanding project, a difficult conversation with a partner, or a public presentation, I want you to remember the biological truths we explored today. When you feel your palms start to sweat, when your breathing gets shallow, when your heart starts hammering wildly against your ribs, that is not a sign that you are failing. That is not a symptom of an impending panic attack. That is the physical manifestation of your body delivering highly oxygenated blood and glucose to your brain. It is your ancient biology waking up and giving you the exact, powerful resources you need to conquer the challenge standing in front of you.
And I want to leave you with a final, provocative thought to mull over as you go about your day. We have just spent the last hour looking at irrefutable data proving that a simple 30-minute synergistic framing can measurably change human cardiovascular function, lower chronic cortisol, and prevent adolescent anxiety at a massive scale.
It's incredible to think about.
If that is true, if just 30 minutes of realignment can do all of that, what would happen if we took this data and fundamentally redesigned our entire society? What if we completely overhauled our corporate cultures, our management styles, our parenting philosophies, and our educational systems to be built entirely around stress optimization rather than the impossible myth of stress avoidance?
Wow.
Could we engineer a world where the daily friction of life, rather than breaking us down and burning us out, literally makes us physiologically healthier, sharper, and more resilient?
It makes you wonder just how much human potential we are leaving on the table every single day, simply because we have mislabeled the body's natural power source as a poison. When you truly understand the profound synergy between the stories your mind tells and the physiological responses your body executes, the murky, overwhelming landscape of modern anxiety suddenly becomes a lot clearer. You realize you don't need to run from the pressure, you just need to recognize that the intense pounding rhythm in your chest is the sound of your own strength, fully mobilized and ready to be used.